new and welcome very much indeed to this. Most of the presentations through the course of the 10 weeks of the summer are Bigelow's own scientists talking about some of their recent discoveries and work that's engaging them. But interspersed throughout that series, we have a few guest presentations, and this evening is a very good example of that, where we're really delighted to welcome Eric Lax, journalist, author, and biographer. I'm going to introduce Eric with a few words of his background, just so that we all understand where he's coming from and his influences in what he's going to talk to us about. He's a graduate of Hobart College, and then after graduating, went with the Peace Corps to the Pacific, spending 2 years there, followed by work with the Peace Corps in Washington. In that capacity, he's traveled over 40 countries around the world, so extremely well-traveled in that respect. But in 1970, he left the Peace Corps to pursue writing full-time, with a strong interest in comedy. And his first book was about Woody Allen, On Being Funny, Woody Allen and Comedy, 1975. Now, I haven't read this book, obviously, I apologize, Eric, but one thing I picked out about it was not only was it a biography of Woody Allen, but a general treatise on comedy. Now, scientists have a special word to use the word treatise, so I'm very interested to see what that might be. Rapidly followed by interviewing Groucho Marx for life soon after that. But Eric has also been very interested in science and medicine as well. And in 1984, wrote about life and death on 10 West, which is essentially about the work of the bone marrow transplantation ward at UCLA Medical Center. Through that work, he was recognized by the New York Times Book Review as one of the notable books of the year and received an award from the Leukemia Society of America. He's also carried out co-authored biographies of Paul Newman, Humphrey Bogart, and Howard Walter Florey, who we're going to hear about tonight in the context of the story of penicillin. He is a contributor to many of the journals and magazines that are familiar to us: Atlantic Monthly, Esquire, LA Times, New York Magazine, Vanity Fair, and Life. I'm going to pick out one aspect of his work which I found particularly interesting. He's a current board member and past president of the PEN Foundation. PEN stands for Poets, Essayists, and Novelists. Now, I had kind of heard about it from its human rights perspective, so I was just trying to check up on that, and it claimed, and Eric will tell us if I'm right or not, it's the world's oldest human rights organization and the oldest international literary organization. So I think you can see that we're extremely privileged to have tonight somebody who not only has traveled the world, has researched that interface between laughter and the seriousness of life and death, but also has some very profound beliefs in human society and human rights. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Eric Lax to you this evening.
For coming out. I think you're probably mistaken in where you're going. Anyway, you're so nice to come. Graham, thank you for that lovely introduction. And yeah, Penn claims that's our story. We're sticking to it. It's our 90th year this year. Just to start off, so I have a sense of where we are and who knows what. How many of you know the name Alexander Fleming? Howard Walter Florey, who we just heard of, smaller group around it. Ernst Chain, all right, that's good. And Norman Heatley. One made it, scratching his head. The reason that I do this is that when we talked about what I might speak on tonight, Tatiana and I came up with the notion that how scientific credit is given or not given is subject, especially for the scientists here in the room, something of intense interest. And the story of penicillin, I think, is one of the great examples of how the person who gets the story told first and has the best PR machine behind him generally is the guy people remember. And as we go through the penicillin story tonight, you'll see that maybe the name of Fleming, while perfectly respectable and belonging there, is not quite as all that it comes down to. So tonight I want to talk a little bit about insiders and outsiders and changes toward innovation and reward, and again, as I said, sort of the benefit of having the best PR machine. Fleming, who we'll come back to in a few minutes, really, everybody says, well, we have penicillin because of Fleming. We have penicillin because Fleming made a really interesting observation, which is that something in a dish inhibited bacterial growth. But he had no idea what to do with it. So he's sort of like a guy who went to the American River in 1848 and looked down and he said, man, there's great gold-looking stuff in there. I don't know how to get it out and I don't know what to do with it, but it's there. So, listen, he gets the eureka moment for that. So but what happened next? Why it took 14 years to turn penicillin into a useful drug is really what we're going to talk about tonight. And the credit for penicillin, I think, really echoes the debate over who among Carl Wilhelm Scheele, Joseph Priestley, and Antoine Lavoisier most deserve credit for the discovery of oxygen, which launched the chemical revolution in the 18th century. Is it Scheele who was the first to make it but didn't publish his findings? He had a lot of bad luck in his life. He also, or at least in his work, he also identified tungsten, barium, hydrogen, and chlorine, and never got credit for that either. Should it be Priestley, who was the first to publish, but like Scheele did not understand what he had found? Or Lavoisier, who was the first to comprehend the value of oxygen as a chemical, and who gave no credit to either Scheele or Priestley, and for more than 200 years has been considered the father of the chemical revolution. So our story starts tonight in that long era of the amateur as the scientist in England, how much that was prized as a way of going about science. The last thing you wanted to do was to make money off something you did. You couldn't really get up and say, I did this. It was just not done. One of my favorite stories is after Charles Wilson was able to take the first photograph of an electron in 1896 in the cloud diffusion chamber that he built at the Cavendish Laboratory. For about 5 pounds, he prided himself on having scientific equipment that he made from scratch and cost almost nothing. There was a toast that was made not long after at a dinner that they had, which was, to the electron, may it never be of any use to anyone. Which, of course, is why the Germans were the great scientific masters for so many years, because all they did was commercialize science to the greatest extent possible. So really, and Germany had a great lead in that through the Second World War. Just a little bit about the characters. Fleming was this kind of the perfect guy if you wanted to have a sort of the absent-minded scientist to write about. He's about 5'6", he had a mustache, he was a very laconic Scotsman. He was not a conversationalist. It was said of him that if you had a conversation with him or tried to have a conversation with him, it was like playing tennis with someone who hit the ball over the net, and when he did, he would grab it and put it into his pocket. It actually worked to his great advantage later on. At any rate, in 1928, he made his famous observation of really an accidental one, of mold that had contaminated a plate, and on second chance of looking at it, he noticed that it had stopped the bacteria that was in there from dividing. And he was never really able to figure out why this happened. He was actually interested in something called lysozyme at the time, which was a naturally occurring antibiotic of very mild quality. It's in tear ducts, it's in mucus, it's in pig's eggs, it's in all sorts of places. He also wrote up his findings of this experiment that he talked about in 1928, in 1942. So in the 14 years that passed between then, it's very hard to think that really everything that he remembered from 1928 might have been as accurate as possible. And in fact, the way he describes it, it's impossible to discover penicillin the way he described it. But nonetheless, he did make the observation, and that's the important thing. One of the great things about him, actually, he kept very sketchy notebooks. And it really kind of proved that his love for doing the experiment was really, he didn't really care about the results. I mean, he liked the results, but it really seemed that he really cared about the experiment more than anything. And he was wonderfully kind of eccentric. He was obviously very skilled in his work. He would take a plate of agar, and he knew bacteria well enough that he could plant, he would paint a picture with spores, just, kind of, you would see what happened, and then as the bacteria bloom, you get a picture. You got a picture of a mother feeding a baby with a baby bottle, a ballerina dancing in all the various colors. So he was quite a guy on that. So he's the first part of the story. The second is Howard Florey. Howard Florey is an Australian who came to England, to Cambridge in 1921, at a time that the Australians were really kind of outsiders. It was very hard to be accepted by what he did, but his hard work really won him champions very quickly. Excuse me, I'm going to take a water here. One of whom was Charles Sherrington, the professor of physiology at Oxford, who in 1932 got the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the functioning of neurons. Sherrington had the best description of science, I think, ever. He says, the more intelligent the question you ask of Mother Nature, the more intelligent will be her response. And he liked Florey's questions and really became a champion for him. Florey, because this is Bigelow, I just have to tell you that Florey is a young student. He spent the summer of 1924 as a medical officer on the Oxford University Arctic expedition to Spitsbergen. And he returned, he found out, with a bad stomach that was the result of a chlorhydra, which is a lack of the normal acid in the stomach. So he became fascinated with that and started putting a glass tube down his throat. He became sort of a sword swallower with this, always taking things in and out of his stomach to check what was going on. This actually would come to great effect because his interest in this, really in the ailments of himself and of his family, so dovetailed with bacterial inhibition that without that kind of interest, I think that the story would have been quite different. He understood that he was Sherrington called him a rough colonial genius. He wrote back to his fiancée, a woman named Ethel. He wrote about 130 letters over the 4 years that they were courting while she was not sure. Do you all remember letters? Did you ever write letters? So you think about this, you'd read these letters that would go back and forth. It would sometimes take 3 months for a response. You'd write something, you'd have an argument about something, it's March. In June comes the response to whatever that was about, and a new fight starts over whatever it was we couldn't remember about then. It was really fascinating to go through that. Florey, however, becomes as he said, he went to a party once in Cambridge and he did his best to persuade people that he was not the rough criminal of the bush that people had expected. And he, as I said, quickly drew, because of his high intellect and his great skill as a scientist, very strong admirers, and including Sherrington and Edward Mellanby, who was the head of the Medical Research Council, which was sort of like our NIH. In 1935, he was brought to Oxford as a professor of pathology. What's interesting about this, he's trained as a pathologist. He's never done an autopsy. Fleming is trained as a surgeon and has never done surgery in anything that goes on. What Fleming did, and I meant to go back to this for a second, because it's so interesting. Fleming had great hands, and he could manipulate what he needed to do very well, and he made quite a good side living. Giving injections of something called Salvarsan, or 606, which was Dr. Ehrlich's magic bullet against syphilis. And you had to give it to such quantity from a huge needle that was at the time that if you didn't get it just right and it leaked into the skin around, you could get gangrene. So that you get syphilis or gangrene. So he had very good hands. He could really do the needle properly, which gave him a nice side business. So Florey comes to Oxford. He realizes that he really needs to modernize the place, and that biochemistry is going to be what's needed to bring science to the next step. And he finds at Cambridge Ernst Chain, a German Jewish refugee who in 1933 fled Germany and came. And here were two really interesting characters. You had Florey, who was just as straightforward and blunt as could be, and you had Chain, he once called himself the temperamental continental, who would take offense at everything, and they had two completely different approaches. Florey was very much kind of the English collegial way of doing things. Chain comes from a background where there's the professor who runs the lab and everybody else follows the principle. So these two, they were good friends for quite a while, but they would have these arguments which, as Chang once said, which just made the walls shudder over what they were doing. He comes in 1935. It's 7 years after Fleming has made his observation. Nothing has happened. Fleming had tried everything he could to get penicillin to stay stable, to pull it out and to make something of it, and was just unable to do it. Sulfur drugs were coming along at the time. He became interested in that, and penicillin just kind of languished as an interesting thing. Florey's largest research project, I think you could say safely be said, was the search for money to do his projects. And he was constantly beseeching various groups for it. And in 1938, as I said, he had become kind of a darling of the Medical Research Council, but he also became acquainted with the folks from the Rockefeller Foundation who had their circuit riders who went out finding scientists doing interesting things. They said they would like to promote his work if he could find something kind of more substantial than what he was doing. He thought that bacterial antagonism was really kind of a virgin field if nothing was going on. And so he gets a Rockefeller grant. Then he needs to bring on somebody who's really good at microchemical methods to do some of the work. He's got a biochemist, now he needs for that. So he finds Norman Heatley, who is, to me, I think the real unsung hero of penicillin at Cambridge. And the three of these men start to work together. You could not find three more different people. I've already described Heatley, Chang and Florey. Heatley is the most quiet, refined, sedate, would not raise his voice person in the world. He felt himself inferior in the lab in terms of the work of the others, but he had the most spectacular ability to take anything in front of him and turn it into, he was great at electrical stuff, at woodworking, at glassblowing, whatever needed to be built, he could do that. And then he had that other great thing that every scientist who's going to be any good needs, and that's massive intellectual power and a way to divine the sort of the Occam's razor through to what's the easiest way, what's the way through this problem. This combination is what in the end gives us penicillin. The three of them are put into, Heatley is put to work with Chang. The two of them do not get on, and finally he's put to work under Florey, and they start to do. Heatley's whole thing is to figure out how to grow the penicillin broth, and and they're trying it in everything. They're doing it in pie pans. They're doing it in dogs' dishes. There was an old bedpan with a lid on it from the Radcliffe Infirmary, which actually turned out to be the best thing. And the only problem was they had stopped making them. And so they came up with a way of doing a slip cast ceramic mold of them for 2 pounds a piece. And over the course of the years, over the course of the couple of years that this was going on, there was a huge stack of wonderful pictures of a huge stack of bedpans in a cold area in the Dunn School lab that Heatley supervises. I won't go into the long process of how penicillin is pulled out of the broth and made into a drug that will kill bacteria, because it's a whole separate story and not what we're doing off to here. But one thing that does need mentioning is that these guys worked on a shoestring. It's also the beginning of World War II, and in May 25th, 1940, they carried out that experiment with mice for the first time to try the properties of penicillin in a living being. So here's the scenario. There's the siege of Dunkirk going on. It looks as though the Nazis will come to British soil at any time. These guys are in their lab. They had finally got enough penicillin together to try it out on 8 mice, 4 controls and 4 who will get the drug. Heatley keeps the sheet of the knife. It's just 2 sheets of graph paper. And one of the pleasures of doing a book like this is the research. And I spent months at the Royal Society in London, where all the papers are for this. And in there, I pulled out the Heatley's sheet for this experiment that he did. It was one of the most exciting things that I've ever seen, because there was, you saw life as we knew it change. Because before that day, anybody with the kind of infectious, strange bacterial infection, you scratch your face on a rose thorn, by the time you're done, you've got a staph infection and you're literally dead. Doctors doctors really, from the time from ancient times to the present, really, Herodotus talked about how doctors would put their patients out on the street and passers-by would make a diagnosis and suggest what to do. And really, in terms of treating the kind of infections that we take for granted now with antibiotics, is there was really no change until then. The best thing a doctor could really do in a case like that was have a great bedside manner and be as reassuring as possible up until the time that the patient died. And then you would go on. But in the course of this, these mice are given a deadly dose of bacteria. The ones who are not treated do what they're supposed to do. They die, and he puts a little red cross by each of them. And he's up during the night of it. But the ones that receive regular penicillin, or penicillin regular, become, in a sense, immortal. They transfer past all this. They live. Well, this is kind of an astonishing thing. In 1940, they write a paper for The Lancet, which was published the day after the London Blitz began. And what was interesting about this is that they had hoped that they could get a drug company interested. And nobody was. They were still thinking about sulfonamides. The chemistry of penicillin wasn't understood. It sounded interesting, but nobody, between the bombing of the buildings and the lack of development, nobody really could come to their aid. But one interesting thing happens. Credit, as we're talking about, is liked by everybody who has anything to do with something that looks promising. Florey had aid both from the Medical Research Council and he had it from Rockefeller. And in the paper, he thanks Rockefeller, in the Lancet, he thanks Rockefeller first and says there was also money from the MRC. Mellenby, his champion of the MRC, writes him immediately, says, what are you doing? You're giving all the credit, what about us? We've really helped you out, because he wants to, he sees a winner coming and wants to be part of the team. So suddenly there's not only friction within the team, but there is within the funders as well. Over the next couple of years, this goes on. In 1942, in August of 1942, there was a second one. By now, they're starting to, they have enough penicillin to start to treat patients. The most touching one of all of these were the failures in the beginning. There was a police constable named Alan Alexander, who had, in October of 1941, scratched his face on a rose thorn. Story I started to tell before. Within 4 months, he was just being completely, it was like worms from inside an apple. He was just being completely eaten up by staphylococcus. They would give him enough penicillin that would just start to treat, make him look good, and then they'd run out. They were collecting it from his urine, because a lot of penicillin passes through the urine untouched. And finally, having just gotten to the brink of health, ran out of penicillin, and the guy dies after all this. But what it shows is how important this is a lesson for you to remember, those of you who aren't doctors. If the doctor says take the full course of penicillin, even though you're feeling better, take the full course. Because if you don't, all it does is make the microbes smarter, healthier, and changeable. So that's one of the great reasons that we have such terrible problems now, is that first antibiotics were given to things that for no reason whatsoever, because they were given for viral infections that they had no effect on, or they were given and then not taken for all the time. So it gave so anyway, that's the lesson. That's the takeaway. Take it for the whole 10 days, whatever they say. Here's where we start getting into the real issue of credit. Florey is worried that the work that he's doing is not attracting enough notice and enough support. Chain is worried that his work is not being properly credited by Florey and others there, because he feels that he's in a very tenuous, and he can't argue, he feels, because he's in a very tenuous position. There's still a certain amount of anti-Semitism in England at the time. He's just a new resident. He feels that if he tries to make a stink, that he can end up in trouble. So there's friction between the two of them. In 1942, there's the second paper that they published on the benefits of penicillin is in the Lancet. And it also kind of goes unnoticed. But the the Times of London picks it up, talks in an editorial about how it's very important that this drug start to be investigated and more work done on it. A colleague of Fleming's at St. Mary's Hospital, a private hospital. You ever, people go to London, you go to Paddington Station? St. Mary's is kind of right. Fleming worked under a man named Almroth Wright, who was George Bernard Shaw's sort of model for the Doctor's Dilemma, for the character of the Doctor's Dilemma. Very interesting guy. He writes a letter to the Times saying, well, it's very interesting you talked about this penicillin suit, because it just so happens that it was discovered right here at our hospital by our very own Alexander Fleming in 1928. Well, people go, my goodness, the press runs over, they do all kinds of stories. You know, there are headlines the next day, you know, miracles from moldy cheese, professor's great cure discovery. The Glasgow Herald, you know, got the home angle on this. They said Scottish professor's discovery. The next 2 days later, Robert Robinson, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize in Chemistry at Oxford, who was the professor of chemistry there, writes a letter to the Times, and he says, well, you know, that's very nice. If we're going to give a laurel wreath to Fleming, as Professor Wright suggests, let's give a bouquet at least, and a pretty nice one as well, to Florey and his team for turning penicillin into a practical proposition. So, the press says, wow, this is great. They get on the train, they go up to Oxford, an hour's trip, they get to the lab. Florey says, through his assistant, I'm sorry, I can't see you today, come back on Tuesday, and I may have 10 minutes. Now, he was doing what you should do at the time. You're not taking personal credit for what goes on. You're not trying to promote yourself. But if you're the press, and you want to write a story, and you go to St. Mary's, and an avuncular Scotsman sits down and tells you all these wonderful tales, and you go to Oxford, and a disgruntled, irritable Australian, foreigner, says he's not going to see you, you know, what are you going to write about? You know, so, from that moment on, the race really was lost for Florey and his group. There was just no way they were ever going to catch up. What did happen, though, is that as penicillin was tried in World War II, and it became so evident how many lives it was saving and how remarkable it was, there was a great deal of promotion for the Nobel Prize in this. Fleming had two great allies. He had Lord Moran, who was Churchill's personal physician, was on the board of St. Mary's Hospital, a private institution that needed funds for its operation. And he also had Lord Bigelow, the pest magnate, who owned the Daily Express and the Evening Standard, combined 7 million readers a day between the two of them. Beaverbrook and Moran were great friends. The Beaverbrook Press has this relentless drumbeat about how wonderful Florey is, and they're doing everything they can to promote this for the Nobel Prize. I will say that Florey and his group have a couple of people on their side too. One is a man named John Fulton, who's a professor of physiology at Yale, who had been at Cambridge with Florey, knew everybody in America. There's a whole story about how Florey and Heatley come to America and with penicillin and get the American drug industry up and running with it, which is quite a remarkable story. And it's really due to Fulton's faith in his friend and his findings. He took him just at face value for everything that he did. But without Fulton, the push to penicillin in World War II, I think, would not have happened. There was a point in about 1943, where the number 2 thing on the wish list of the Defense Department was penicillin as a drug. The first one was the atomic bomb. So, in 1944, the Nobel Prize, which had not been issued in 1943, was about to be issued was given for the first 2 years. There was a tremendous amount going on. The Beaverbrook Press was really pushing Fleming, and Fulton and Mellenby and a man named Henry Dale, who's the president of the Royal Society, these very powerful figures in the British medical establishment, are writing to the people at the Nobel Committee saying, it's not just Fleming, it's not just Fleming, it's Florey, don't forget Florey, don't forget Change, don't forget the guys who are doing this. And it was so much so that in 1944, when the awards for the first 2 years were done, and it was clear, and Fleming did not win on himself, that John Fulton even writes to the head of the committee and says, you know, thank you for not being, you know, bowled over and browbeaten by old Beaverbrook, by old Beaverbrook, and let him sway your committee. I always like that. There are, you know, all sorts of ways of measuring success. One of them, I suspect, is the Nobel Prize. And in October of 1945, the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine was given. And it went to Fleming, it went to Florey, and it went to Chain, split three ways. There'd been a great deal of division in the committee about how it should be done. Should Fleming get half, and the other two get split the other half? And in the end, it was done. So there was the three of them. But still, even though you reach this level of credit, the following thing happens. Fleming still is the best known guy about penicillin because he was from the beginning. The New York Times runs a nice piece about the prize being given, and it says that the Nobel is given to Fleming and two co-workers, and no names on the two co-workers. John Fulton sends a telegram to the Times and says, "Folks, let's get this. These are not junior colleagues of Fleming's. These are the guys who actually made it, took it out of the broth and made it into a drug that has, without these guys, there's no penicillin." So the next day in an editorial, their names are properly mentioned. But what we've already seen has happened. Fleming is here, always will be. Florey and Chain, even though they get the Nobel, can't even get their names in the paper. And to me, and the greatest sadness of all of this, because things worked out better for these guys, Norman Heatley gets absolutely no credit whatsoever. It's not for about 45 years that people start to appreciate what Heatley did. Heatley, because of the old way of looking at things, was just considered the hands, but he was also the mind. And the Nobel can be given only to three people, all of whom happen to have to be alive at the time. And there's an argument to be made quite reasonably for the three guys who got it. But I think the person who made penicillin possible, not only by his hands, but I would really argue by his intellect, was Norman Heatley. And Henry Harris, who was instrumental in the development of monoclonal antibodies and who followed Florey as professor of pathology at Oxford in 1963. A quick thing about that, because I know I'm running out of time here. This is the most astonishing. Talk about how fame can be fleeting. In 1963, this is 20 years after the Nobel Prize has been awarded to these guys, Henry Harris goes into the pathology auditorium, about this size at Oxford, and it gives a lecture and says to the students, the 100 students in the class, who knows who Howard Florey is? Three hands. Three hands go up out of the 100. One of the students at the time, at about the same time, reports that he's sitting down at Amazon having lunch with with a professor who says that what he's doing, he's studying. He says, "Oh, I'm looking into mucus," and it's Florey. And the student says, "Isn't this pathetic? Here's this poor old guy, biding his time here at Oxford. His career is coming to an end. He's just looking at spit." And no idea that this guy had anything to do with penicillin. At any rate, so Henry Harris, who had done this quiz, had to me, I think, summed up the way credit should be given in penicillin in the following way. He said, without Fleming, no Florey or Chain. Without Florey, no Chain. Without Heatley, no penicillin. So I'm happy to talk about this or anything else you'd like in the 20 minutes we have remaining. Thank you very much for your Great. Well, that settles that. Yes, sir.
First, it's true that the Nobel Prize can only go to three people, so he got screwed from the beginning because of the rules.
Mm-hmm. He did. But it's so weird because the guy who really, it's just, there's an argument for all of them. And this was almost the time to say give it to four, because, but you're right. I mean, it's just, you can only give the three, and that's the way, but there's always one of the ironies of that. Is that and this is true of any number of other prizes, I'm sure that it's given. This is just the one that's Yes?
Well, only in recent years that there's been some understanding that Darwin wasn't alone
Right.
in the discovery of evolution. I can't remember the name. He was out in Indonesia with the other scientist. Florey, yeah.
Yeah, is that you know, again, it's there are any number of discoveries that have been made in silence, and then somebody else comes along and does it, and you're like, you know, I did this 3 years ago. You didn't write it down, you know, you didn't publish, you know, and that's always the problem. Yes.
Speaking of that, can you speak of any current things that are going on?
Oh, you know, that's a really good question. I actually used to have an answer for that. Somebody was telling me about a recent one, and I'm trying to remember. I can't. There is actually there's somebody who's pressing it. Well, I can't remember the story. There's a guy who's been spending a tremendous amount of money pressing his claim for that he was gypped out of the Nobel, and I'm just blanking on it. I don't know. I could. But he spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. I mean, he's been taking ads and he's saying, you know, I did this first, and I've been left out. So, can you believe it? Yes.
Were Fleming and Florey independent discoveries, or was that knowledge?
No, they built on. What happened is that in abbreviating the story, I'll just out. So, Florey is looking into antibacterial agents. And he's also interested in lysozyme, which Fleming had found and had written papers on. What's interesting is Fleming made two really interesting discoveries, really seminal discoveries, that Florey and Chain followed through and figured out what they were really about. But one thing is that they had, in doing a research, this is before LexisNexis, they're basically just going through magazines trying to find papers, and they found the Fleming paper on penicillin. And they also found out that they had actually in their mold storehouse there, exact mold that they needed. So it was just very fortuitous that they went on from there. So it came to the point actually at one point where shortly after the first word of the benefit of penicillin came along, Fleming wrote to Florey and asked if he could have some. It turned out that the child of someone who was a very close friend of his was very ill, and Florey gave him about half of what they had. And what was astonishing about this kid had meningitis, and Fleming, again showing his great hands, was able to manipulate a needle into a very dangerous place, and do a shot that most people wouldn't have given, and he was very pinpoint accurate. What was sad about the relationship in this, you know, you look at. I've made some jokes at Fleming's expense, and I don't really want to leave it at that. We're all human. If you're sitting there quietly in your lab and somebody writes a letter to the Times of London and says, you know, you're the guy who did this. Yeah, I got it right here. And everybody comes over and takes your picture and takes it. Well, you'll say, okay, well, you know, if the world comes to you and says you're the greatest man alive, you know, you're probably going to say, oh no, it's not me, it's Howard Florey. Or you're not. You're going to say, okay, thank you. You know, if you say so, I'll take it. And I think I think Fleming had a couple of opportunities where he could have set the record straight and didn't. And his fame was so great. I mean, he was famous on every continent. There's a crater on the moon made for him. There's a statue of him outside of Bullring in Spain because penicillin saved the tornadoes who been speared by the bulls. Yes?
Maybe this seems like a naive question because you guys all seem very scientific, but did someone patent penicillin?
Oh, you know, I was hoping somebody would ask that. So here's the thing. Here was one of the raging issues in Oxford and in London when the Florey team that was making progress on this. Florey said, absolutely, we can't patent this. We do this for the benefit of mankind. Chain says, are you crazy? Of course we patent it. And certainly if this had been in Germany, it would have patented it in an instant. But because British medicine at that time was still that sense of the amateur, the sense that you didn't profit out of this, the decision was not to do it. And what happened is that the work that was done with penicillin in America, the American drug companies made billions of dollars on penicillin. Now, two things the truth is the British patent would have only been good for about a year or so because enough changes were made they could have patented it. But it did change the attitude in Britain about patenting. Suddenly, after World War II, the whole committee was put together to help bring things to patent because it was clear that was going to be a necessary thing to do. But it was and it was actually part of sort of the anti-Semitism that Chain felt, is that by doing this he was, somehow being kind of money grubbing, it was bad, even though there was nothing for him in it. It was a very unfortunate, thing going on. But certainly everybody changed after penicillin, that was for sure. Yes?
If you mentioned this, I apologize, but did penicillin immediately spell the end of sulfa drugs?
It did. The great thing about penicillin, unless you're allergic to it, which I am, is that penicillin in great quantity doesn't cause you any harm. The problem with the sulfa drugs and with carbolic acid, which was used to pack wounds, in World War II, is given at a concentration just below lethal problems. So it works, but you come close to really hurting yourself by doing it. What was astonishing about penicillin and why it really did spell the end of sulfa drugs for the most part is that you could give it, it was clean, it passed through, there was no damage to you from doing this. And in fact, for people like me who are allergic to it, the first shot is free. You get it's after that you start building up antibodies to it. But yes, it did, because it was kind of, and what was so miraculous about that, to its detriment, I'd say, is that because it was so easy to give, because it had no side effects, it was given. There was penicillin lipstick. There was penicillin chewing gum. It was crazy what happened to it because. And Fleming, another thing to his credit, when he gave his Nobel speech, he was very clear to point out how it had to be. You had to follow the dose through. You had to do it because how easy it was for bacteria to re-educate themselves if you didn't really take it all the way. So he saw the danger of this right from the start. Yes?
Isn't it also the case that Fleming used a paradigm shift that Florey provided in order to make the next step? Because he was working under the assumption that, if I recall correctly, the penicillin was doing something like the lysozyme, it was an enzymatic thing. So the mechanism that he was proposing led to a dead end, which led him to drop it. And then the next generation came up with the idea that it was a different mechanism.
The problem was extracting it to have it in a purified form and a stable form. And they couldn't, it was kind of like the Scarlet Pimpernel. I mean, you would think just as you're starting to pull it out, it would vanish. And it was Heatley who said, you take it from out of ether into water. And he suddenly said, if we've done that, if you take it into something, let's take it back. Nobody thought about just doing the reverse extraction. And by doing that, there was a moment of kind of this Hamlet moment of, am I acid or am I base? That the penicillin is going through when you fucking, and you could get it to stable. And then what they found is, having done that, it would be stable and easily transportable. Because that was the other thing. Could it survive with temperature change? Could you be able to take it out to the battlefield? Would it still keep its potency after 3 weeks? And that was the issue that the Oxford guys resolved. Does that make that sense?
It's sort of in parallel, contemporary with the idea that protein had to be the hereditary molecule, DNA was too simple, and then that paradigm changed, and we eventually got to
right. And it was really just the technique that you had is that Fleming said, I'm not a biochemist yet, I'm not a biochemist. We don't. And he had sort of basically chemistry graduate students trying to help him out, but nobody who was kind of far enough advanced. And what Heatley was able to do was to take another branch of science, understanding what Florey had said in the beginning. If we're going to move forward, you've got to bring biochemistry into this. So that was the thing. Yes.
I wanted to ask, as a writer, trying to communicate science to a lay audience, what are your comments or thoughts on how science can more effectively address the complexity of climate change? Because I've been using the book, The Merchants of Doubt, to how disinformation over the last 20 to 30 years has misled people in the general public on issues, whether it's the ozone depletion or now climate change, attacks on Rachel Carson and so forth. And my colleagues who are scientists at the university didn't seem to understand what was going on when the WikiLeaks thing happened. Because frankly, how can journalists, how can writers help scientists who are not prepared for being defamed?
Well, I hope that, yeah, I know what you mean. I hope there are a number of them doing that. And certainly, and there's certainly those working on Holy Sangre is it's a great example of that. But it's, in my case, it was, I read an obituary in 1999 of a woman named Anne. Isn't that terrible? Isn't that terrible? Not the damage. Anne Miller. There we go. And it was a two-column, sort of quarter page in the New York Times, and a picture. I said, and I read all this because it's a way to say goodbye to people I liked and to meet new people at the last possible moment. And so I was reading through this, and I said, why did she get two columns and a picture? And it turns out she got 2 columns and a picture in 1999 because she didn't die in 1941. Because she was the first person really rescued by penicillin in 1942. She was the first person really rescued by penicillin. But what it talks about in there is it talks all about Fleming. And Fleming saying, my best patient, and all this kind of stuff. And the only problem with that is that toward the end of the piece it says, but the actual making of penicillin into a practical drug was done by a group of people at Oxford with no names. This doesn't, the Times still didn't get it right, after all those years. My life is quite well, I have to put it down. I love the Times, but. Yes.
Yes, I'm very interested in coming to this lecture. Because my dad was a doctor, you say, of college during World War II. And maybe the story is that how Florey had to start hospitals first. And he was on the first hospital. He moved from the United States to England. And they set up hospitals all over.
Wow.
And one of his stories is that he actually met these people. He met one called Florey.
You probably mean Florey, because Florey was out in the field doing all they went to North Africa and did a lot of field trials. Oh yeah.
I wish he was here.
Oh, it's interesting.
I'll be able to tell you more.
Yeah, because that stuff in North Africa was so interesting. They launched the Italian campaign from there.
Learning to be a doctor in the 1930s and 40s, and how he went into pediatrics first as a study, and how sad it was that they didn't know for, like you said, just something else.
Yeah, one of the guys we were talking about going. Oh, sorry. Oh, the question was, her father had been a doctor in North Africa at the time that Florey.
In London, in England.
Oh, in England. I'm sorry. But it met Florey, and we were talking about setting up hospitals during war. And one of the things that had to be that penicillin was so effective for, obviously, was treating war wounds. And that Fleming did Florey did a number of weeks of work in North Africa before the Italian campaign. And one of the questions was, a great number of British soldiers were out of action because of gonorrhea. And the question, and one shot pretty much of penicillin was enough to take care of the gonorrhea. But if you put all these guys back ready to be soldiers again, how much were you going to have left for those people who were really wounded? And so the question was, do you treat, these rascals and send them back into battle, and risk not having enough for anybody else who's injured, or not? And the question goes all the way up to Churchill, who gives the Delphic answer of, this should be used so it has the best effect possible. So the answer was, treat the rascals, get them back in the battle, and let's hope we have more penicillin by then, which is what happened. Yes?
Why was there such a shortage of penicillin?
Just because in the beginning it was so difficult to manufacture, it was done. It's the difference between 1D and 3D. It was really in the beginning just done on things they pulled off the surface. And it was only when Heatley came to the United States with Florey and then stayed on to work trying to develop this, is that in Illinois, actually, with the Department of Agriculture, they used a lot of the techniques of brewing beer in doing this, and found that you could do a big vat and use, by having what amounted to a huge aqualung down at the bottom, getting oxygen all the way through the tank. And once there was enough oxygen to do that, suddenly you were able to do mass production. So you were, instead of just taking your spores from here, you were able to brew it in gigantic vats. And that's what really turned it. If you look at the graph for penicillin production, it goes like this. I mean, it's just, there's about a year, there's almost none, and then they get a little bit, and then they get quite a bit, and then, within 6 months, it's, there's enough to treat everything. Let's jump in the hat, and then this fellow back here.
My wife, her father was head of pathology for the country, but he was a surgeon. It was like your story.
Oh, that's fantastic.
And just for me, non-scientific, he met his wife going over before the war, and she had red hair, and she was seasick the whole way over, and he said to me, I noticed the woman with red hair and green skin.
Yes, this gentleman back there.
Yeah, I guess the moral of the story is always trust a Scottish accent.
Yes.
I guess I have a wider point about science communication, which is kind of what this Cafe Scientifique is about. But do you think there's any lessons from Fleming that modern day scientists could learn to try and help communicate our own science? I speak as a Bigelow scientist.
I think that one of the things that I learned in the 2 science books that I've done is how well scientists can communicate what they've done. I think a good scientist is a natural communicator because they have to explain their results very clearly. And if it's taken out of technical terms and just explained what it does, I think there's an incredible power that's in there. And one of the I think it works 2 ways. I think that both the general public doesn't need to be afraid of learning about science. That it's not. If I can learn about science, then anybody. And the other is that the science shouldn't be afraid of the general public's ability to be able to grasp it, because it's so fundamentally beautiful that you can't help but just be in wonder of it. I mean, I think that's the great thing about science is how elegant the results are, and that an elegant experiment can often breed an elegant result, and that's so gorgeous to see and so finally easy to understand that nobody should be afraid. So I think the key is to each side to stop being afraid. This lady right here. Yes.
He came to the United States, I guess.
Yes.
Was he embittered that he didn't win the Nobel Prize? And financially, did they all? I know there was no patents.
None of them made a penny. The person who did was Edward Abraham, who was a very distinguished scientist, a junior member of the team. And he, in the next generation, once the patents came in, he was working on cephalosporin, the next generation of it. And he patented the whole chain, the whole ring of that. So he made billions by the time it's done. And he made 3 trusts. He had one for his family. He had one for the Dunn School at Oxford, and one for one of the women's colleges there. So he put a great deal, not billion, but hundreds of millions of pounds that had come as a result of that. So he was the first one to do that. Heatley was very quiet. He would never speak. He never raised his voice. He would never say that he was unhappy. The only displeasure that he ever had, and he really adored Florey to the end of his life, each of their lives, is that Florey came back from Stockholm, from the ceremony, with sets of blue wine glasses for all the people in the lab who would work there. And Heatley's wife said, actually, I got to know Norman in the last year of his life, and this book wouldn't have been possible without him giving me his diaries, which he had never let come out before. He had given out the scientific stuff, but the way I know about the relations in the lab and what it is, because his diaries, he was a fabulous diarist, and all of his emotion went into the diary. I'll tell you, one of the things, and he's so meticulous about doing things, is the following. It's the night of the mouse experiment when life changed and they realized that there was this great antibiotic. He got home and he said, well, I put my underwear on backward today. And he said that maybe that's what brought us the good luck. Anyway, so the glasses, they come back with the glasses. He said to his wife, he said, you know, I like to see the color of the line and put them up on a shelf. And he never used them. And, you know, one time, you know, the cupboard opened and the glass fell down and he didn't seem to be at all upset. Toward the end of his life, toward the end of his life, Oxford really did begin to realize what they'd done, and they gave him the first honorary medical degree they had in their 800 years history at that point. But still not enough. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, maybe take a final question.
Oh, sure. Yes.
I'm really concerned right now that politics is threatening science. And when you ask scientists questions, they're thinking about their funding, they're thinking about, to the point where we would go and see the salmon count. The woman would say to me, I'm not allowed to answer that. She was a government worker. And I mean, it's on that level. How do we get free?
Yeah, there are two big problems. One, you know, penicillin came to market for about $125,000 in 1940s money. And as you know, a drug to come to market today is somewhere between 900 million and $1 billion to $1.3 billion. And all the trials that have to be done. I think one of the, for me, one of the great sadnesses is I think that why American science has been so good for so long is that we put a lot of money into research and development, both privately and governmentally. And it's a sad day that so little is being put into R&D for that. And there are all these orphan diseases out there that nobody will make a drug for. And it's terrible. On one hand, you want safety because, you know, at the thalidomide, a drug gone bad is a really bad thing. On the other hand, you really want to encourage scientific experimentation and development. And yeah, so no, it's terrible in that. I mean, I think if you look 20 years down the line, the way we're going is you'll see Nobel's not coming to American science, you know, because there's not the backup that's been theirs in the past. And to my wife and myself, I have to say that New York Times almost always gets it right. They just make a joke on that. That's true, they did. So it's a private, we have a very personal stake in it, so I just wanted to be sure.
Where is his book available? Is it out yet?
Is my book?
Yes.
I think you can find it in remainder shops anywhere. I think the paperback, I believe the paperback is still in print.
It's on Amazon.
It's on Amazon, there we go, good.
What's the name of it?
It's called The Mold in Dr. Florey's Coat. And the reason it's called The Mold in Dr. Florey's Coat is that when you come up with a title for a book, you need something that's going to be, you know, it's like a dog in the pound, you know, you want to get the attention. The development of penicillin wasn't going to work. And what happened is that the night after, the day after the mouse trial, when it looked, you know, when Dunkirk was looking so bleak, it was Heatley who said, you know, if we have to scatter, if the Germans do come, if the Nazis do come, and we have to break up the lab, we don't want them to get our stuff, what are we going to do? And it's Heatley who said, we'll take the spores, we'll put them in the linings of our clothes. They'll stay there unmolested, you know, nothing will happen to them. We'll get to a safe place, we'll extract them and get back to work. So that's where the mold of Dr. Florey's Coat came from. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Non-Bigelow scientist. We're very pleased to welcome Dr. David Shaw, the founder of the IDEX Laboratories in Portland. He's going to talk about another great passion of his, which is marine protected areas, the Sargasso Sea Alliance. But I can't let Eric go without saying what a great treat it is to have someone like this come to talk to us on a Tuesday evening in Bay Harbor. Thank you.